Hi all, Professor Shipley back with you. This is attempt number 2 at this particular lecture after we've had some technical difficulties on the last time around. Let's hope it actually works out this time, and it might be to your benefit. Maybe it'll go faster the second time around and save you a few minutes. Not counting on it, but it might happen. So last time around, we got through the theoretical aspects of group theory. Today, we're going to get a little bit more practical on engagement, and then we'll talk a little bit about districting, since that is what your project, it's not due this coming week, but the week following, to give you a little bit of extra time, is going to be about. So engagement, when we talked about groups, right, the idea that groups exist and that they benefit us. Let me back us up just a little bit for the refresher. With pluralism, groups organize, followers offer leaders support, leaders offer guidance and messaging for the group and represent those group issues. What representative government in the modern sense really is all of those groups working together and competing. They're competing for more members, they're competing for more resources, and then in turn they're competing with each other to perform whatever it is that they want to achieve. Hopefully you've gotten the opportunity to watch the Fighting Goliath, the Texas Coal Wars, as a nice little microcosm of groups in action. So that's how pluralism works in theory. Engagement is when we're actually getting involved in those groups. So we teach engagement lots of different ways in government, although we kind of focus on two types. We'll talk about those in just a second. But I want to break away from kind of a textbook version of this. And I want you to be thinking of engagement as anytime you're interacting with the outside world. Now, I know we're not doing a lot of that these days because of, where most everybody is stuck inside. As much as possible, but even the communities that you're engaging with online and in the limited capacity that you're able to these days, still consider that engagement, still consider that a form of social and political participation. So anytime we're interacting with other folks, we're going to consider that fair game for our discussion today. So when we talk about the varieties of political participation, I said there's two that kind of get most of the attention. And we leave out a couple of varieties from most of our political discussions. So the two that really get a lot of play is inside participation. This is the idea that you should have direct access to decision makers and policymakers. And usually we talk about the access that money can provide, or being somebody in a position of influence, or lobbyists have that sort of inside access. They can call up a person, get them on the phone, have a conversation with them, take them out to dinner, fly them someplace on their private jet, and have that direct one-on-one access. Most of us don't have that. Most of us don't have the resources to do that, to the extent that we maybe we belong to some groups. Maybe you're an NRA member, maybe you're a AAA member. Your dues that go to that organization can be spent to hire lobbyists who might have that level of access if they're very good. But most of us don't have that sort of inside access. We're not out playing golf with the president on a regular basis. So inside participation usually gets a lot of attention in that we typically say we don't like it. Then as far as everyday person having access, usually we summarize that or sum that up with electoral participation, which is voting. This is when we tell you, go out and vote. That's how your voice is heard in America. Never mind the fact that a majority of Americans don't vote. We'll get to that in a minute. Never mind the fact that voting only happens every so often, every 4 years for president, every 2 years for the House of Representatives, every 2 or 4 years for city and state offices as well. So it's a fairly blunt instrument. It's not something that can really be the end-all be-all in democratic systems. There has to be something more there because, again, most of us aren't voting, and we're not voting regularly. We vote very sporadically, and kind of if all it is electoral participation is our only access to the system, then we don't necessarily have much access at all. So the other two varieties of participation that usually get short shrift but are vitally important, the first we're going to call grassroots. So this is all of the direct political engagement that can happen between election dates. So if you're protesting, if you're doing petitions, if you are writing letters and making phone calls and showing up at town halls, if you're so angry that you're making signs and protesting and showing up to events, that's going to be grassroots organizing and participation. That's getting a message heard even beyond the bounds of election day. And the other variety of participation that can happen a lot and happens on a regular basis is all of the not directly political stuff, but still has a social or political message. And we're going to call that sort of organization or participation, civic participation. So the picture you have here is, a group of folks, probably like a Habitat for Humanity, building houses. If you think homelessness is a problem, if you think, the wealth gap or lack of affordable housing is a problem, you can show up and vote for a politician who may or may not think that that is an important issue that they want to work on. You can sign petitions, or let's be honest, maybe the most direct and most effective thing you can do is you can show up on a Saturday and help build a house. So we often leave out grassroots and civic engagement, and that is to our detriment because, as we just mentioned, if we're going to rely totally on electoral participation, people don't vote. So our absolute best case scenario when it comes to voting is presidential elections, and this gives you turnout rates going back to like World War II. And what you're going to find is that on our good years, we are 60% are going to show up to vote and probably less than 60%. The difference that you're seeing here in the green versus the yellow line are just the different ways that we decide who could potentially be voting. If it's a voting eligible population, or these are people who are legally allowed to vote, how many of them show up versus how many people are over the age of 18, voting age population. And how many turn out there. And you can kind of see as that gap widens, there's stuff going on. One of the big ones would be our incarceration gap. So once you get into the 70s, you're going to start seeing the divide between green and yellow start to spread. Those are people who have felonies on the record. They're not eligible to vote. Here's going to be some of the other limitations on voting as we add more requirements. Not everybody is going to be able to be considered eligible to vote, but whichever one you want to go with, you can tell the last, in your lifetimes, 60% would be really good on one metric, and 50 to 55%, about 1 in 2, about half the people in America are going to show up and vote for president. This gives you turnout rates for both presidential and midterm elections. You're going to see midterms are generally lower turnout. We vote for president before anything else. Midterms, non-presidential elections, fewer people are going to show up to vote. This is the one that you really care about. This is Texas. So what you're seeing up there, that blue line up top, that is presidential turnout nationally. And there's our 50 to 55% national turnout. That red line that's right below it, that's presidential turnout in Texas. So even in Texas, we're never going to hit these days 50% turnout for presidential elections. We have low voter turnout. We have low voter registration. We know that we're riding the bottom of the barrel in terms of showing up to vote. And this just gives you an idea. We're rolling 5 to 10% lower turnout than the country on average. The green line about midway through the chart, that's going to be your midterm elections in Texas. Those are your gubernatorial, the governor's elections. So when we're picking the governor, when we're picking senators for the U.S. Senate, when we're picking all of those executive branch offices in the plural executive in Texas, we're lucky to get 1 in 3 people to show up to vote. So it's about a 30% turnout on average, and it just drops down from there. So in Texas, we don't vote much. And if you're looking for local elections, they're not on there, but they track decently well with that orange line for special constitutional elections. 10% turnout is about right for picking for picking mayors and city council people and school board and things like that. So if we're relying on voting, I'm sorry, folks, we suck at it. That's going to be problematic for us if that is going to be the salvation of our democracy. And I wanted to give you that one you don't care about. Let's go with this one. Because this is going to give you the breakdown. This goes back to the 90s. It's a similar rate going back to the 70s. But this is voter turnout by age. So you can kind of track it from 18 to 24 up to 65 plus, and they're going to go in 10-year increments, and those are the lines. And obviously the lowest line are going to be the youngest folks. So one of the things that you hear about a lot with voting is, man, kids, why don't they show up and vote? Why don't young people vote? The next time you hear that, know that it's not a generational thing. It's not that Gen Z, many of you all, or millennials, who are a little older than most of you all. It's not that they were the first generation to not show up and vote. This has consistently been the case going back to the expansion of voting to 18, 19, and 20-year-olds, and even before that. The younger you are, the less likely you are to vote. And over time, as you get older, you become more likely to vote. So the folks back in the 90s who were not showing up to vote, those would have been your Gen Xers. And we're going 15, 20 years later, they're jumping up 2 lines. So the same folks who are showing up about 25% of the time in the 90s are showing up at about double that rate today. And that just goes with age. So it's always been the case that younger people don't vote and older people do vote. And if you're ever wondering why politicians tend to talk about things that matter to older people, like retirements and Social Security and, healthcare for older folks, and they're not talking about the cost of school, job security or job prospects for people graduating from colleges today, this chart does a lot of explaining that for you. They're talking to the people who show up and vote. And also, if you're wondering why, Joe Biden versus Bernie Sanders is leaning towards Biden, it's because Biden's talking to old people and Bernie's counting on y'all to show up and vote at better than 25% turnout. So we get to, we'll oftentimes ask the question of why aren't young people voting? And it's really, the question is just, why aren't people voting? Generally, there's lots of reasons why people might not be engaged in electoral participation or broader participation. But usually we're talking about electoral participation. Lots of different ideas, and you can kind of run through them. A lot come into whether we feel like our vote is going to make a difference. If you don't want to vote for the lesser of two evils, if you don't want to vote for a bad candidate, this is one I heard a lot in the last presidential election. Well, I have a choice between Hillary and Trump. Some of us, might be looking at it now and thinking like, well, yeah. You get where I'm going. I don't have to say it and put it on record on a YouTube video. So if you're thinking about the lesser of two evils, you're still having to vote for evil, right? So whether my vote's going to make a difference, whether you see a major difference between the parties or the candidates, or how they're going to influence the system, if you don't think that matters, then a vote doesn't make much logical sense, right? A separate issue might be disinterest or alienation. I don't care. It doesn't matter to me. I've got better things to do. I've got video games to play. I've got school and work and all sorts of everything else that are more pressing on my time. That it's not something that I'm going to spend my time worrying about and doing. One other argument that gets out there is maybe you can make the case for satisfaction. If you don't have a problem with the way things are going, there's theories out there that you're only likely to vote when things get bad. We'll perhaps be testing that out this year. How does turnout move when we're worried about a national crisis? So with millennials and Gen Z, oftentimes we get this argument that you're narcissistic, you're entitled, you're not looking out for the greater good of the community. Sometimes this gets wrapped into your over-reliance on technology, things like that. here's the argument that gets made, a fair amount about young people. And again, I stress to you all, it's not a young people thing, or I'm sorry, it's not a your generation thing. It's a young people thing generally. And I've got some saving grace for you. Yeah, let's ignore that. We don't care about stealth democracy. Keep going, keep going, keep going. So here's your saving grace. This is what I wanted to draw your attention to, because this is the next time you hear that argument about young people, I want you to come back to this chart right here. And what you care about on this chart is that blue line. That blue line goes back to the 1970s up through 2005. It's held steady since then. Maybe it's gone up even a touch more, that blue line. What that blue line is the percentage of 18-year-olds that would be 12th graders in high school, so 18-year-olds approaching graduation, who have spent at least one day in the previous year doing public volunteerism. And what you're going to see up there is, going back to the 90s, it's 75+% of 12th graders have done some sort of public volunteerism in the past year. And before you start telling me, well, that's high school seniors and there's all those different reasons that you're likely to be volunteering. And that's true. You've got counselors and school telling you that you need to do this for colleges and for scholarships. You've got all the different organizations that you might belong to that have service components. You might be doing it for, religious institutions, whatever else. Maybe you got picked up with, the case of beer in the back seat of the car. You got to go spend some time with a judge here at the county, and they gave you some volunteer hours as a punishment. We don't care why. What we care about is whether or not you've done it. And it turns out that actually the peak for public volunteerism is not at age 18. Rather, it's at age about 20 to 21. So it's kind of that middle college years is actually when you're going to reach the maximum peak in age group. And then it starts to taper off as you get older. By the time you're in your 30s and 40s, we're kind of at a low point in terms of volunteerism. And some of that makes sense, right? This is just life cycle effects. When you're young, you tend to have a little bit more time. You tend to have a little bit more pressure put on you to volunteer. As you get older, the jobs get a little more serious. The hours get a little more strenuous. Kids and family commitments come along. You tend not to have the same amount of time to donate. And then as you get higher up in age, the kids get a little older. Once you hit retirement, especially, time frees back up, and you get another pop towards the end of life in terms of public volunteering. But what I want to really, the big number here, is that 76% number. Because what that number should remind you of is over here, the oldest folks in America are voting at about 70%. That 70% is kind of our magic number. The thing about it is that when we average out participation and we're just looking at voting, or we're just looking at civic engagement and participation, we're seeing different sides of the same coin. That 70%, 75% number is a magic number for us, because that's the rate of participation. The type of participation changes over a person's lifetime. We get older, maybe we don't have time to donate a Saturday, but we do have time to donate a little bit of money to that charity or that cause. We do have time to show up once every year or two and spend an hour learning about candidates and going and casting a ballot. So the nature of participation changes, but the amount or the level of participation doesn't. And that matters to us quite a bit, because what we know is that the more we participate, participation is addictive. The more we participate, the more we feel like that we can make an impact, the more likely we are to engage more in the future. And here again is perhaps your politicians, why they are worried about those older folks, because they are, again, most likely to vote, but also they volunteer at a fairly high rate and get involved in those civic organizations. So some final thoughts with regard to groups and group theory is that modern democracy works if IFF, that's if and only if, it's not a typo, if groups are effective. And modern groups don't necessarily operate the way we would want them to, right? We imagine a system where groups emerge around good ideas, they pursue their cause, they achieve their goal, and then they disappear. And yet, that's not exactly what we see happening. Here's where you get, and you'll notice perhaps that I'm not said special interest groups. I've not necessarily said lobbyists outside of saying that lobbying exists. But when we talk about special interests or highly organized interests, we're talking about interest groups that exist as a business. They've got money, they've got longevity, they've become professionalized as opposed to being kind of a natural development. And these tend to threaten the elite and masses balance. So we've talked about previously the idea of those iron triangles. If we're talking about interest groups that are more formal, it's not just groups of citizens, but it is industries that have been built up to influence the political system, and they get really, really good at it. So you can imagine, for example, the NRA or AARP, these are organizations that are businesses. The president of the NRA is making lots and lots of money. In fact, it turns out the NRA is, buying these folks nice mansions and providing their security details and offering them, flights on their private jets and that sort of thing. This is a high dollar operation. And they have no incentive to disappear. So their incentive is to keep ratcheting up what they see as problematic and keep drawing in more members because that becomes part of their business. And it crowds out the space. There's very little space then for other, if we're using the NRA as an example, there's very little space for other gun rights organizations to develop that might have differing opinions. We know from polling data that lots of NRA members, for example, would support stricter background checks on gun purchases. That's actually a broadly popular move, but it's not something that the NRA is willing to endorse. But those folks don't have an alternative besides the NRA to pursue those interests. So you get into the situation where you get, and here's some data, but it hasn't changed much. Do you agree or disagree with that special interest groups have more influence than voters? And an overwhelming majority of Americans tend to agree with that. And that's just the nature of the groups and the system that we have in place today. Let's keep going, pop it through. And I wanted to give you a little bit. Political parties, we can think of lots of different ways. Generally, though, the way I want you to kind of conceptualize political parties is they are just another group. They're one of the formal, professionalized sorts of groups. They're not going anywhere, but they are our political teams. We have the leaders, those politicians that represent the party and tell the party what it stands for. They're asking for our money. They're asking for our time and volunteering. They're asking for our vote. And they need to provide benefits to us. We're not going to go into super detail there on political parties because they're just another sort of group.